Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Be Bold America. I'm your host, Jill Cody. Our program today will be quite thought-provoking. I know you've been following the Israel-Hamas war, and when I distributed the media release last week for this show, that was 12 days ago, 88 journalists had been killed in the war. Now, at last count that I could find, it has been 94. Our program today is Moral Courage, Profiles of Investigative Journalists, and we'll be discussing how moral courage is in the spotlight given the upsurge in authoritarian regimes worldwide. Why do investigative journalists stand up to intolerant regimes, often single-handedly? In the book, Moral Courage, 19 international journalists explain their rationale for the work they do. To really appreciate why these people literally, and I do mean literally, put their bodies on the line for the rest of us to learn the truth, we must understand what motivates these investigative journalists to expose crime and corruption despite the personal risks involved. We have big things to do. Dr. Anthony Feinstein is a neuropsychiatrist and professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, who explores the psychological effects of conflict on journalists. Dr. Feinstein consults with news organizations including the New York Times, CNN, and the Globe and Mail, providing educational sessions about frontline journalists' emotional health. He is the author of 9 books, including his most recent, Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists, that we will be hearing more about today. In 2000, Dr. Feinstein was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to study mental health issues in post-apartheid Namibia, and in 2012, he produced a documentary titled Under Fire, based on his research of journalists in war zones, which won a Peabody Award. Welcome to Be Bold America, Dr. Feinstein. Do we have you? We're trying to connect to Canada here. This is live radio, I want to remind people, so we should have him either on the internet or on the phone soon. Eliza is working very hard to connect, but we're going to hear about some people that are in his book. For example, David Frenkel, who's in Russia, originally a physicist specializing in liquid crystals, who was compelled to be a journalist by his outrage at President Putin's increasingly dictatorial rule. In 2020, Russian police brutalized Frenkel and broke his collarbone as he covered voting on changes to the Russian constitution. Also in the book is Nihad Dixit, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, who has been harassed, threatened, stalked, and charged with inciting hatred for her coverage of human rights abuses in India, including human trafficking, honor killing of women, and women being sold off as babies. We'll also hear about Hopewell Chinono, I think is the name, from Zimbabwe, who has endured imprisonment and harassment for exposing government corruption, including the embezzlement of COVID-related healthcare funding in his impoverished nation. In addition, there was also Gwen Lister in Namibia, who was repeatedly censored, arrested, and detained by the South African government for criticizing South Africa's apartheid practices in Namibia and reporting on South African human rights abuses. Eliza, do we have our guest yet? Are we connected? Hello. Welcome to Be Bold America, Dr. Feinstein.
Yes, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, we're delighted. First of all, your book, Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists, is beautifully published. It demonstrates deep respect for the 19 journalists who are profiled. It is brilliant and compassionate book. Thank you for this.
Well, thank you very much.
First, who is an investigative journalist? I have heard the terms reporter, journalist, investigative reporter, and investigative journalist. And in my view, reporter and journalist are not synonymous. I was chair of a department at a university once, and they had the School of Journalism, not the School of Reporterism. And I remember decades ago, I was an avid watcher of the PBS NewsHour, and decades ago they had a marketing type of ad on the station, and they said, "We report and you decide." And I went, I'm not watching the program for reporting. I wanted journalism. So can you help define, what investigative journalist is, and the difference between a reporter and a journalist?
Well, good question. I mean, my disclaimer is that I'm a mental health specialist. I'm a psychiatrist, but my work focuses on journalists who investigate difficult stories, difficult topics. And so for me, that's how I would define it. These are journalists who want to get to the bottom of something that is potentially very complex and difficult, that comes with danger and risks for them. And if you look at moral courage, that certainly defines the journalists who are profiled in this book. So all of them go and investigate corruption, bad government, crime. Where did the money disappear to? Why are people in jail? Who are being persecuted, etc. So they ask difficult questions, and then they try and investigate the origins of what's gone wrong in their societies.
Well, your book grew out of a need to understand why specific journalists remain so committed to the profession, despite the grave risks this entails. What did you find?
Yeah, so that's really the heart of this book. Why do journalists essentially put their lives on the line to try and answer difficult questions? And I think when it comes to motivation, you've got complex factors at play. There isn't going to be one particular dominating issue. But I think there's a thread that links all the journalists in this book, and that's they have something what I call moral courage. And why is this moral courage important? Because it helps them keep at bay moral injury. So it becomes helpful to start off with, well, what is moral injury? So let me give you a definition for that. It's a condition that can arise from witnessing or perpetrating or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass. So it comes from things that you might do or other people do, or things that you fail to do that transgress your moral compass. And in response to this, we have emotions like shame, guilt, or anger, or disgust. And these are very uncomfortable emotions to live with. And one way of keeping these emotions at bay is to show moral courage. And that's what each of these journalists in the book have done. If you want to get a better understanding of moral courage, then there's some really lovely texts on the subject. I like to reference an author by the name of Rushworth Kidder, who basically said you have to have three ingredients for moral courage. Number one, there needs to be the background of risk or danger. Number two, you've got to have your own moral compass, which is very finely set, finely tuned. And then thirdly, you've got to have the agency or the drive or the energy to pursue your agenda. So you've got to have all three factors. You've got to have the danger, you've got to have the agency to do something, plus you've got to have your moral compass finely set. And when you have those three factors intersecting, at the heart of that, you've got your moral courage. And so when you look at these 19 journalists in my book, 18 of whom are alive, one of whom was murdered, they all have a very strong moral compass, and they show a remarkable moral courage, which allows them to go and do this extraordinary work.
So it's sort of like a hero's journey. I mean, I was reading about, what was her name? Gwen Lister. What happened to her when she was a teenager, and she was doing the right thing. Can you tell us more about her?
Yeah, that's a remarkable story. So she was South African, and she was traveling on a bus in Cape Town in the 1960s during the apartheid era, and buses were segregated. White people could sit on the ground floor. There were double-decker buses, but black people and people who are not white had to go up the stairs to sit above. And she was sitting on this bus, and an elderly black woman got on the bus, laden down with parcels, and instinctively Gwen gave up her seat. She saw that this woman would struggle to go up the stairs to get to the top of the bus, so she gave up her seat. And that caused a sense of outrage on the bus because other people sitting on the ground level said, no, you can't do this. This is breaking the law. Black people can't sit here. So the question is, why? Where did her moral compass come from as a child? And that's a fascinating question. But over the course of her subsequent life, she stuck to this. She never wavered in terms of her moral conviction. And so, after she'd gone to university and studied journalism and trained as a journalist, she went to the neighboring territory of Namibia, which was occupied by South Africa, and where there were the rules of apartheid were still there. And she started to work actively to undermine apartheid, to try and help liberation movements in Namibia get to a more equitable society. And she used journalism as a way of doing that. And this was a very difficult journey for her because the government obviously strongly opposed what she was trying to do. They resorted to many dirty tricks to try and intimidate her and scare her. She was arrested. She was isolated in Namibian society. A lot of people avoided her. They saw her as a troublemaker. Her newspaper was attacked. She started her own newspaper called The Namibian. The newsrooms were shot up. There was firebombed. She lost all her equipment. So she went through tremendous difficulties to try and keep telling her story. But she refused to bend because she had and still has this very strong moral compass. And she stuck to it. And at the end of the day, when Namibia became independent, and the liberation struggle won out and the country became independent in 1990, she had played a critical role in allowing Namibia, helping Namibia to get to an independent state. And thereafter, which was really interesting, the government that took over from South Africa basically wanted to honor her, and she was offered all sorts of honors and sweetness, which she turned down. She said, it's really bad for journalists to get too close to power. And so she stuck to her moral compass. And the new government was a bit dismayed by her reluctance to accept what they wanted to offer because she wanted to maintain her independence. She felt that it would compromise her own moral standing. And so throughout this long and, you call it heroic, long and heroic life, she has maintained her moral integrity and stuck to her principles. And that's a remarkable journey.
What I found fascinating about her story is that she was very young when this happened. And it was just a moment. The look on the face of the elderly black woman, she said, hit her like a thunderbolt. And it was that quick that gave her that sense. That moral compass. We think we can develop morals over time, but it can also happen in a nanosecond, right?
Well, that's really intriguing. Yeah, where did this come from? Because as she told me, she didn't grow up in a family that spoke about politics. There wasn't a discussion of, that they did not discuss apartheid at the dinner table. She had lovely parents, but they weren't parents who were involved in the struggle against apartheid. This was just something that she felt instinctively was wrong, and she made a stand as a young woman, and she stuck to it, and she has stuck to it for the rest of her life. So, when searching for the origins of where does this come from, one is left scrambling for an explanation. But very clearly, it was a belief system that was formed very young. She was very resolute in sticking to it. And as I say, she's never wavered from it. With some of the other journalists in my book, one can see that there were influences from parents that guided them in that direction. But with Gwen Lister, you don't see that.
No, you don't. It just was astounding. And, well, this is a good time to take a break. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. Our topic today is Moral Courage, Profiles of Investigative Journalists. And our guest is Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who is a neuropsychiatrist and professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and author of Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Hello, K-Squid listeners. I'm Tom Hartman, and each weekday at 4 p.m., I bring you a different perspective on the news than you're likely to hear on most media outlets. Please join me on KSQD, Santa Cruz, your ink spot on the dial for the Tom Hartman program, heard now for the first time ever in the Monterey Bay area at 90.7 FM, weekdays at 4 p.m. That's Progressive Talk and Conversation with me, Tom Hartman, weekdays at 4 p.m. on KSQD 90.7 FM. Tag, you're it.
Would you like a friend to hear this interview on moral courage, profiles of investigative journalists? Well, Be Bold America is available as a podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and many other podcast platforms. Subscribe for free from your favorite podcast platform or listen to Be Bold America's homepage at the ksqd.org website. Dr. Feinstein, you do have a website that I just wanted to mention before we get more into the book. It's I just Googled mental health therapy for journalists, and it came right up. Do you want to mention something about that?
Yeah, thank you. So, I've been researching journalists who work in conflict zones for a very long time, going back to 1999. And it became clear to me that freelance journalists don't always have access to the kinds of help that they need. And they do very important work. And so I have established a non-for-profit fund that can help freelance journalists get therapy for mental health difficulties. If these journalists have had a connection to a Canadian news organization or worked on a particular story that has relevance to Canada, then they would be able to reach out through this fund to seek psychotherapy for any mental health needs that they might have. And so it's been going now for a couple of years, and it's being used, and I'm pleased to say it's making a difference to the lives of freelance journalists.
Well, congratulations. And this leads me to ask, what are the psychological attributes that enables them to keep going?
Yeah, so that's once again, I think, such a key question. When you look at the journalists whom I profiled in this book, we come back to this issue that I think is central to what motivates them and what sustains them, which is this very strong moral courage. I think everyone has a moral compass, but it just varies as to where it is. Some people have a very finely tuned moral compass. Other people have one that's much less finely tuned. These journalists basically live by the moral code, and so to a man and woman, they've said to me that when they are confronted by egregious human rights abuses within their country, bad governance, when they see the effects of crime and cartels on their society, they can't keep quiet, because by keeping quiet, it becomes an act of omission, and an act of omission is a source of moral injury. I come back to the definition that I started off the discussion with. This is a condition that can arise from failing to do something. I should have spoken out. I should have said something. I should have done something. And so these journalists all recognize that through their profession, they're able to reach a wide audience. And if they don't use their skills as a journalist, if they keep quiet, then they feel the sense of moral hurt, that they've let themselves down, and they feel a sense of shame and guilt. And that becomes a very powerful motivating factor that drives them to keep doing this work. This doesn't mean that they don't feel scared when they're threatened. They're acutely aware of the dangers. At times, they even back off and take a break from what they're doing to allow the dangers to abate a little, because, there's a strong sense of self-preservation when these journalists, don't want to get locked up. They certainly don't want to get killed. So they, have to be very careful in terms of how they navigate this very difficult terrain that they work in. But all of them say to me they will not back off when faced by what they perceive to be the gross human rights abuses in their country, or the negative effects of drug cartels on their society. And so they're driven by this intense moral courage, and they don't back off. And I think that sustains them, that keeps them going. They would rather take on a bad regime and deal with the consequences of that than keep quiet. Keeping quiet for them is not an option.
Well, I learned years ago myself that whether it's in a family or a work situation or at the level you're speaking about, that silence is taken as agreement. Mm-hmm. You need to be able to speak up wherever you are. Family, if you don't agree, you need to say something because silence is taken agreement. I guess they are taking that, principle to one of the highest levels.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. I mean, when you look at all of them, they represent, in many ways, the last vestiges of civil society in their country. The rest of the building blocks of civil society have been destroyed. The courts are no longer independent. The judges are in the pockets of politicians. The NGOs have been forced out the country. There is nothing left, basically, supporting democratic society in many of these places, except the voices of these lone journalists. They stand up and they don't keep quiet. And the population know this. Those who live in these countries like Belarus and Russia, many of them recognize that these journalists are the last vestiges of our civil society. And so they look to them to understand what is going on in our country, what is happening. They're the people who can keep the population informed of what's going down in their own countries and own societies. So they have a very important role. They have an enormous influence, and because of that, governments work strenuously to try and destroy them, to bring them down, which happens all the time in the countries that I've highlighted. So I think for those reasons, one has to admire enormously what these journalists are doing, because it's work that comes at a great risk to them and to their families, but they're so committed to it that not even a dictatorial regime that resorts to dirty tricks can silence them completely.
It really kind of makes me speechless, what they do. And I have some journalists that I wanted you to talk about, but is there someone in your mind after explaining that a story that you want to share of one journalist?
They're all remarkable because they all share this characteristic. Mm-hmm. But I can speak to, Neha Dixit, the Indian journalist, a woman who has...
that was one that I wanted you to talk about, was her. Yeah.
Yeah. So, she's devoted her career as a journalist to highlighting the plight of women in India, child brides, women who are sold off.
The honor killing of women.
The honor killings, yes. And
trafficking.
That's made her deeply unpopular with a large segment of Indian society. She has stood up for minorities. She has, she's a Hindu, and she could keep quiet and enjoy all the trappings of what India's got to offer, because the current government is a very nationalistic Hindu government, and if she kept quiet, she would be in the majority that could enjoy all these privileges. But she doesn't. She doesn't keep quiet. She would speak out against the abuses against the Muslim minority, and these kind of things enrage the Hindu nationalists. India prides itself on being the world's largest democracy, but there are many aspects to Indian society that are not democratic, and so the authorities have tried very hard to bring down Neha Dixit. They have come up with trumped-up charges against her. She's forced to appear in court on a regular basis to address these charges. If she doesn't appear in court, she could go to jail. In addition to that, she faces relentless, vicious online harassment of a sexual nature. Her apartment has been broken into. She's been threatened. But she's kept going doing this. And she doesn't have to do this, right? She could, as I say, she could enjoy a very comfortable life in India if she kept quiet. But, as I spoke earlier, keeping quiet is not an option, because if you keep quiet, it becomes a source of moral injury.
Well, that's a silence again, right? And
exactly.
Then saying, now I agree.
That's exactly it, and so she doesn't.
Mm-hmm. After our Jim Hightower's commentary, I wanted to get your ideas after you hear it, so I'll just take a break now. You're listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the KSQD.org website. My guest is Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who is a neuropsychiatrist and professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, who explores explores the psychological effects of conflict on journalists. Dr. Feinstein consults with news organizations including the New York Times, CNN, and the Globe and Mail, and he is author of Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. We will be right back after Jim Hightower's commentary titled, Tom Paine, What a Guy.
In my view, the greatest of America's founding fathers was not Washington or Jefferson, nor technically even an American. Rather, he was a British immigrant and an itinerant agitator for real democracy, enlightenment, and universal human rights. He was Thomas Paine, a prolific, profound, persuasive, and widely popular pamphleteer in the movement for American independence. With plain language and genuine passion for the cause, Paine's 47-page pamphlet, Common Sense, was so compelling in its support of the revolution that it was passed from person to person and even read aloud in taverns. But Paine wasn't content with democratic rhetoric. He actually believed in an egalitarian society, and his post-revolution writings, including Age of Reason and Agrarian Justice, unabashedly demanded that the new hierarchy of U.S. leaders fulfill the promise of democracy. Even before the War for Independence, Paine called for slaves to be freed and slavery prohibited. After the war, he terrified most of the gentlemen of means who had signed the Declaration of Independence by insisting that non-landowners be eligible to vote and hold office. John Adams was so appalled by this that he decried Common Sense as a, quote, crapulous mess. But Paine just kept pushing, calling for women's suffrage, progressive taxation, state-funded child care, a guaranteed minimum income, universal public education, strict separation of church and state, and adoption of some of the democratic principles of the Iroquois nation. This is Jim Hightower saying, don't tell small-minded right-wing demagogues like Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott, but Thomas Paine was woke some 250 years before their push to impose autocracy, plutocracy, and theocracy over us. This revolutionary founder championed social justice and economic fairness. We are all Paine's children, said one historian, for he imbued America's destiny with democratic impulse and aspiration. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is made possible by you subscribers to Jim Hightower's Lowdown on Substack. Find us at jimhightower.substack.com.
We're back. Our topic today is Moral Courage, Profiles of Investigative Journalists, and our guest is Dr. Anthony Feinstein. Before we move on, Dr. Feinstein, any thoughts on Jim Hightower's commentary on our British founding father here in the States?
Well, I enjoyed that very much. Thank you for sharing it.
You're welcome.
I'm ashamed to say I was not aware of this remarkable man, but hearing a description of what he did, he was clearly far ahead of his time, and the kind of democratic principles that he was pushing does resonate with the journalists that I interviewed for my book. So these are common threads that run across all different societies. People thirst for democracy and freedom of expression, etc. And it sounds like this man had a very significant effect on the development of your own moral culture.
Well, I certainly saw the moral courage in him because he was not very well liked. He was agitating for that egalitarian society and not making many friends while he did it. So I don't think anybody showed up for a memorial service, and I don't think anybody knows where he's even buried.
And that's He sounds well ahead of his time.
Well ahead of his time, yes. And I thought he really demonstrated back then moral courage to face what the naysayers back then. So I wanted you to just quickly go over again so that we understand it clearly. Defining moral injury, and then also going over Rushworth Kidder's 3 necessary components. Again, just as a good foundation for the rest of the show.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so moral injury, I want to stress, is not a mental illness, but it's a condition that can arise from witnessing or perpetrating or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass or your code of ethics. So it comes from acts of commission, things that you do or other people might do, but also acts of omission, things that you failed to do. I should have spoken out, I should have done something. And in response to moral injury, you've got a number of well-defined emotions, such as shame and guilt, also anger and discussed. It's a condition that the military have known about for a long time, going back to Vietnam and well before that. But in journalism, it's something that has only become more apparent to the profession over the last few years. So certainly, journalists can learn from the military when it comes to moral injury. My theory in my book, my hypothesis, is that moral courage is one of the factors that help keep moral injury at bay in all the journalists that I interviewed. And I very much enjoy and learn from the work of Rushworth Kidder, who defined certain components to moral courage. In other words, you've got to have your moral compass, very finely tuned. You've got to have the agency or the drive or the energy to pursue your moral beliefs. And then it all has to be done against the backdrop of, danger and risk. And as you demonstrate very nicely, if you have two of the three ingredients, as it were, you don't have moral courage. For example, you can have a strong moral compass, and you may be in a dangerous situation or want to risk to yourself, but you don't do anything, and that's timidity. Or you can have a lot of, you could be in a dangerous situation, and you can have a lot of agency and do something, but you don't have a moral compass. And that's just physical courage. That would define physical courage. And so you've got to have the three components occurring in the same person to have this phenomenon called moral courage. And to repeat, I think it's my hypothesis that moral courage is a very powerful factor that these journalists call on to keep their moral injury at bay. And I feel it's a thread that links all the narratives.
Thank you. So I don't know if you get Fox News in Canada or the other numerous right-wing radio and network stations that we have in the States. But do you think democracy can survive with Fox so-called news, continuous partisanship, propaganda, and really downright lying? I don't know how we could keep going and stop anger when outrage is their business model. And, we need to save our democracy. But I'm very upset by what the media is doing and some so-called journalists.
Yes, no, I can understand that. I think we can become complacent at times in our Western democracies that the things that are fine, that democracy is always going to survive. But some of these journalists who I interviewed basically sounded a warning. They said, be very careful in your countries because what's going down in our countries become a playbook for demagogues in Western countries. And they cited the fact how dictatorial politicians learn from the playbook of countries like Russia and Hungary and Turkey, where you have, these strong rulers who have worked resolutely to undermine the media, to destroy the media, who want to control the media. This becomes a very attractive model to unscrupulous politicians in the West. And indeed, they start using the tactics from some of these countries closer to home. And that's a real wake-up call for our democracy, because we need to have a vibrant free press. And if you work to undermine it, if you work to discredit journalists and demean them and attack them, then you're attacking one of the essential pillars of civil society. And so, while this book is focused on countries far away from the shores of Canada or the United States, the message is absolutely relevant to us in our countries, because we live in a global economy. These things, we're all interconnected. And events that take place far from home have the ability to affect us directly and profoundly. We know that. So we have to be vigilant in terms of, protecting our democratic institutions. And I share your concern that when you've got very powerful media outlets that undermine the integrity of the press, who resort to lies and distortion, and they do it in a way that reaches millions of people, it becomes a very significant threat to our democratic institutions. I agree.
Well, one thing that is very upsetting about Fox so-called news is no one that watches that network knows its origins. I mean, it was meant to be a right-wing propaganda network. It was started that way. It was promoted to President Nixon that way, but it didn't get really going at that time until Rupert Murdoch gave the money. And it was a lost leader for Rupert Murdoch for a long time. And Roger Ailes' view of journalism treated journalism as politics and just another way to market and monetize politics and journalism. And he actually said, we have no obligation, we meaning Fox News, we have no obligation to tell the viewer anything not to our advantage, meaning Fox News' advantage. And that is to monetize the news. So, the roots of this network is really frightening. And he made the viewer feel welcome and safe and separate from people not like them. And is very, very divisive network. And so I'm concerned about how we're going to keep democracy alive with such intentional sabotage. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing the background to Fox News, which I was not aware of. But, I share your concern. But at the same time, I'm also optimistic. I think we are remarkable journalists who, operate by a very different moral code, who understand the importance of their work, who recognize the necessity of good journalism, that's fact-based journalism. They work very hard to promote that. They're very skillful. They do have a strong moral code. They understand the importance of a free media and a truthful media to civil society. And so I think, I understand your concerns and your worries, and absolutely they're justified. But I do think there's a counter movement, which I've described to you. And that's why I think, when you look at the journalists who I profiled in my book, we can learn from them. They become an inspiration to us and to journalists closer to home, because this work is so vitally important, and we can learn from them. So I do think there's another side to the media, to journalism, which is, they hold to the kind of moral code that we feel is the right one. That's based on fact-based journalism. That there are no distortions, and as much as you can with the news, and that's very important. And they're not insubstantial. And so my hope is that in time, they decide that's going to win out. I do believe that with the passage of time, we move towards something better in society, slowly, bit by bit. It might not be apparent from day to day or month to month, even from year to year, but when we have a look at the long arc of things, and I think Martin Luther King said this so well, we move towards something that's better. And so, yes, there are tremendous threats that are working to undermine our democracy, and part of the media is playing an unfortunate role in that. But there are many wonderful, good journalists and news organizations who are not doing this. And my hope is that in time they're going to win out, and I believe they will.
That is very hopeful. It reminded me of an analogy I heard years ago, which is, you think of an airplane leaving point A to point B and that it's a direct flight. But actually, they're constantly they're off course and constantly changing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I think that's the way our history and our future goes. In the book that called Ailes, The Loudest Voice in the Room by Gabe Sherman, was excellent on the history of Roger Ailes and Fox News, and he interviewed people who worked at Fox News. So I just wanted to let you know where I received that information. And also, Russia is in the news a lot, and you have, and we've heard about the death of, or the murder of Navalny, and people being pushed out of windows and that sort of thing in Russia. But you have one of your investigative journalists, David Frenkel. Can you tell us his story?
Yes. So I highlighted two Russian journalists in my book. The only country that has the unfortunate honor of having two journalists in this book, one of whom is dead, and I can speak a bit about her. But David Frenkel is a remarkable man. He is not by training a journalist. He was a physicist who felt so upset about what he saw happening to Russian democracy. He felt compelled to pick up his camera and start creating a visual record of the democratic movement in Russia and the degree to which the Russian government was trying to undermine it. And so he shifted career and he became a photojournalist, documenting human rights stories and issues in Russia. And the government, of course, came after him. The local authorities came after him. They roughed him up. They broke his arm. He was threatened with incarceration in a mental institution, which harkens back to the way the Soviets dealt with dissidents. And so, you can see that he paid a tremendous price for his principles, but he felt he just couldn't keep quiet. He just couldn't continue working as a physicist when he was so distressed by what was happening in Russian society. As I'm sure you know, things have gotten worse and worse for journalists in Russia. It got to a point that with the invasion of Ukraine, you couldn't speak out at all against it. And so many journalists have gone into exile, including David Frenkel. He was forced to leave Russia because of the what the government was doing to journalists.
And the woman in Russia who was killed. Tell us about her. Anna Politkovskaya, and she was a very famous journalist. And she spoke out strongly against Vladimir Putin and what she saw as the egregious human rights abuses that Russia perpetrated in the wars in Chechnya. And, she was quite scathing and open in her contempt for Vladimir Putin. And she was told repeatedly by people in a newspaper, family members, friends, tone it down. Don't speak out in this way about Putin because it's such a risky endeavor. And, journalists were getting killed, and she knew it as well. She attended the funeral of one of her colleagues and said at the graveside, I'm next. She saw it coming. So she knew what the risks were, but she was painfully aware of what the risks were, working for a Russian newspaper that had lost a number of journalists killed because of their opposition to the Putin regime. But she wouldn't keep quiet. And ultimately, she was murdered on Putin's birthday, which I think was very, very, very symbolic. Oh, very symbolic.
Yeah.
How was she murdered?
She was shot in the entrance to her apartment building. Mm. Yeah.
Wow. Well,
so you get a sense of how extraordinarily dangerous this work is, and she paid the ultimate price, of course. The Turkish journalist that I wrote about, Can Dündar, survived an assassination attempt in Turkey. Someone tried to shoot him as well, but thankfully didn't succeed. But he took on this dictatorial Turkish regime, and he's been forced into exile as well. So he's living in Germany. So you get a sense of how very dangerous this work is, and yet, despite it, these journalists will not be silenced. They will not keep quiet.
It's astonishing. If you're just joining us, my guest is Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who is a neuropsychiatrist and professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. And Dr. Feinstein explores the psychological effects of conflict on journalists. Dr. Feinstein consults with news organizations, including New York Times, CNN, and the Globe and Mail, and he is author of Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. And you may just put in your browser mental health therapy for journalists and find that website. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Tomorrow on Talk of the Bay, K-Squid presents John Malkin's interview with singer-songwriter Maddie Diaz. Maddie Diaz brings her guitar to the Felton Music Hall on Saturday, March 30th, on tour with music from her new album, Weird Faith. Hear Maddie Diaz on Talk of the Bay tomorrow, Monday, from 5 to 6 p.m. here at K-Squid 89.5, 89.7, and 90.7 FM and ksqd.org. Many voices, one station.
We're back. And Dr. Feinstein, also maybe a little bit more on how journalists are affected emotionally by their work in these world's most dangerous places, including the war zones and countries lacking freedom of press. They have moral courage, they have agency, their ability to face risk and danger. But what toll does that take on them emotionally? I remember reading the story of a woman on the mental health therapy for frontline journalists in conflict zones. Tell us about her story. She came back and couldn't talk, or
Oh, yes, yeah. So the reason that I got involved in this whole area of studying journalists goes back to 1999. I am a researcher at the university, but I also have a clinical practice for 2 days a week, and I was referred a woman who had a very interesting presentation. The neurological service thought she had had a stroke, but after extensive investigation, they couldn't find evidence of a stroke, and there were certain unusual or atypical clinical features, and so she was sent to my neuropsychiatry practice, and she turned out to have a condition that we call conversion disorder or functional neurological disorder, in which you present with what seems to be neurological symptoms, but they are really being driven by intense emotional distress. And this is a woman did very well with therapy. She recovered, and she turned out to be a frontline journalist. And she had become emotionally unwell, covering conflict in East Africa. She had covered a famine, seen a lot of people die, and this had been very distressing to her. But she had never reached out for help. And she explained to me that had she done so, she was fearful that her organization, the news organization, would pull her from the field, and she would never return to this kind of work. And she really loved this work. It gave her great meaning. And so she was fearful of this, and so she kept quiet and tried to deal with her emotional problems without professional help, and she couldn't do that. And by the time she got back to Canada, she had this major breakdown. So I was really intrigued by her history. She was very interesting. I learned a lot from her. But I was also somewhat surprised by what I saw, what I thought was a punitive attitude towards her profession. And so I asked my research team at the time to do a literature search on what was written on journalists and trauma and conflict, and we couldn't find a single publication, not one. There's nothing in the literature written on journalists who go to conflict zones or to war zones and how they function emotionally. And so, struck by this gap in the literature, I wrote a grant application and sent it to an organization in your country, in Washington, D.C., the Freedom Forum. And they basically funded the very first study of journalists, war, and emotions. So I'm very grateful to them for doing that. And we undertook the study looking at a number of large news networks, CNN, BBC, Reuters, Associated Press, a number of the big American networks, looking at their frontline journalists and doing a very detailed inquiry of how they responded to conflict. And first observation is that journalists are very resilient. The majority of journalists will not develop conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, despite the risks that they take on the front lines. But the minority who do develop these conditions is quite a significant minority, certainly a lot more frequent than what you'd see in the general population. And the most striking finding from our first study was not this. I mean, it's the notion that someone goes off to war can become traumatized by it is hardly a novel observation. But what was striking about our first study was that the journalists who had developed PTSD or depression or substance abuse were not getting therapy for it. That was the big important observation. And to the credit of certain news organizations, they started to take this research seriously and started to change their policies, recognizing that you can't send off people to the world's most dangerous places and just give them a flak jacket or just give them a helmet and assume they're going to be okay. That you have to look after psychological issues as well, emotional health as well. And so slowly, bit by bit, this culture of ignorance started to change. And over the last 20 years, there's been a sea change in the way...
Whoops. We lost our guest. My goodness. I guess Eliza can try to reconnect with Dr. Feinstein. Well, one of the things that I was going to try to talk to him about was the leader of the Republican primary, Donald Trump. He talks about the media as the enemy, and I think that is a real issue when we start analyzing these foreign journalists. He did foreign journalists in his book of what they are going through to expose corruption and money laundering and government links to crime. And, when you have a front runner running for the presidency of the United States of America, talking about imprisoning journalists, saying that journalists are the enemy, speaking very poorly of them at his rallies and trying to make them the other, otherizing journalists. It doesn't bode well for our own country of what can happen. And I don't know that everyone really realizes how important their vote is. There, Dr. Feinstein, I think we have you back.
I'm sorry, yes, I just lost the thread over there.
I know, and something happened, some gremlin, and I remind people this is live radio, so we just go forward. And what I was just talking about while Eliza was getting you back on air was the Republican frontrunner for our presidency, Donald Trump, talking about the media as the enemy and wanting to jail the media and speaking rudely at them all the time and otherizing them. This is something we're dealing with in the States, but do you have any thoughts about the front runner of the Republican Party for the United States of America?
Well, when I was doing my research on this topic, the Serbian journalist Stefan Ksenovic basically referenced this as well. He said, he looked at the United States and said, you've got people like Donald Trump who are learning from our leaders who demonize the media, who want to control the media, want absolute control of the media. They want to control the message. Unscrupulous politicians recognize that. They understand that the media has got great power, that you can reach so many people and you can potentially control the narrative if you can control the media. And so they work strongly to undermine a free press. And that's obviously, that's morally egregious behavior. It becomes a source of deep moral concern to many good citizens and a source of moral injury to certain journalists. And that's something that's clearly playing out in your country at the moment. And we all look at it from abroad with a sense of great concern.
Well, inside the States, we look at it, we're just, I don't know what the right word is, just terrorized by this. It's an everyday thing, and it's, in my view, it's anti-American. One of our pillars of democracy is the fourth estate, and it's anti-democratic. So we have a very, very clear choice coming in November, basically down to one party is pro-democracy and one party is anti-democracy or pro-Putin. Well, to get on to our Keep, Stop, Starts, in these last few minutes, I'd like to ask what ideas you might have for us to keep doing, stop doing, start doing, as they relate to moral courage and moral injury and, the necessary components that Rushworth Kidder has, and anything else that you might suggest.
Yeah, I think, just to touch on your last point, I think it's really important that we don't become complacent about our democracy, that we understand we have to work to keep on supporting it, to support the pillars of democracy. And one of those is a free and vibrant press. We can look at other countries in which the media have been undermined, and you can see the degree to which it destroys society in those countries. So we can learn lessons from that. But we should not be complacent about what's going on at home because, and we've spoken about this earlier, unscrupulous politicians do look to countries like Russia and Turkey and India for a playbook about how can they control the media, how can they undermine good journalism. And so we need to be constantly vigilant on this point. I think we should also celebrate the work of journalists who keep us informed. One of the things that I learned with my work very early on is that we cannot ignore what's going on in countries far from home because we're all interconnected now. If we want to understand why terrorists flew airplanes into the World Trade Center, we need to understand what's going on in the Middle East, for example, countries far away from us, because we're all intimately interconnected now. And how do we understand that? Well, we do it through good journalism. Journalists keep us informed. They are our contemporary historians. They let us know what's going on. And for them to do it effectively, they need to be free. They should not be demonized. And they need to be respected. And so good journalism becomes key to our survival as a democracy. And it's key to keeping us informed of what's going on in the world because, without wishing to belabor the point, events that take place far from our shores have the ability to profoundly affect us, as we have learned. And for all those reasons, we need to be constantly vigilant in protecting freedom of the press and freedom of speech.
And to wind up here, the New York Times byline is, "Democracy dies in darkness." And it seems to me we need our journalists to show the light on what's happening not only in our countries, but in the others as well. So I wanted just to thank you so much, Dr. Feinstein. Thank you for being our bold and impressive guest today. I just thought I'd mention at the end of the show for a short time, I was a student at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, and I have very fond memories of the Canadian people, and also for a California girl to live up near the Northwest Territories was quite eye-opening.
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your interest in my work and for your questions. I very much enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for being our bold guest. What's next on Be Bold America? Please join us on Sunday, April 7th, when we kick off Earth Month with Everything, Everywhere, and All at Once. Our planet is dying, but you won't see it on the nightly news. As the European Environmental Agency reported, quote, "We are entering an era of total climate effery," and you know what the F stands for. The underestimated extreme heat occurrences, the rising ocean acidity that is scaring scientists, the unchecked deterioration of biodiversity loss, and water and food crises around the world are almost beyond our capacity to correct. As Casper Benjamin Reimer Bohorskov, a Danish climate activist, stated, quote, "We are not prepared, have no plan, don't know how bad it's going to get, and have no time to waste. Everything and everyone is at risk." Journalist Betsy Rosenberg will be guest on Sunday, April 7th. Betsy began her broadcast career in television, working for ABC Sports for the Olympics, and then worked in radio as a reporter and anchor for 2 days with CBS News. She left her job in news coverage to start an environmental beat full-time, hosting and producing a program called Echo Talk. Her show was heard nationally on Air America Network and attracted over audiences of 50,000 listeners. Please join Be Bold America on Sunday, April 7th at 5 p.m. to hear the news media is not covering the biggest, if it bleeds, it leads story in history and what we can do about it. As a reminder, Be Bold America is available as a podcast, and I want to give a special thank you to Be Bold America's program engineer, Eliza James, and to our station's program director, Howard Feldstein. You are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz, KSQD Prunedale, Many Voices, One Station. Listen worldwide online at ksqd.org. Stay tuned for Cats on Dogs. My name is Jill Cody, and thank you for listening to Be Bold America. Until next time, keep, stop, start.